Hi folks, welcome back to Some City. I'm Tom Jackson, and we are here in beautiful downtown Somersworth, New Hampshire. Today I am delighted to have the chance to talk with Martin Rumscheidt, who is a theologian and writer, and his latest book is called In Search of a Theology Capable of Mourning, with the subtitle of Observations and Interpretations After the Shoah. Welcome, Martin Rumscheidt.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Tom.
The title is, I found from the first time that I looked at it, is quite intriguing. Can you tell us about the title and kind of what's behind such an interesting choice of naming the book?
My clear intention was, when I'm dealing with the past of German history, whether it be in the industry, whether it be in the church, whether it be in government, that there was for a long, long time after World War II an utter reluctance to address the Nazi past. In the late 60s, early 70s, a couple of psychologists, husband and wife team, published a study in German, which is translated into English, is The Inability to Mourn. And what they wanted to explore was what are the phenomena of mourning that are required in order to deal with a past that is an incredible burden. And for me, as a theologian, particularly also as a person in the church, the cooperation that was offered to Hitler by the majority of German believers, Christians, non-Christians, but also particularly in the leadership in the churches, was such that one can only be ashamed to think about this, which is certainly true in my case. I'm an ordained minister, so I have some connections with the life and times of the church. And for me, it would not have been possible in the 70s to become a minister in Germany. I mean, I'm too young for that anyway, but supposing I had been old enough to do this, I would have not been able, given what I know about the past, and particularly in connection to my own family, it would have been hard to do this. And I was fascinated by the phenomena of the inability to face and to just keep on denying or suppressing. Now, the contribution of theologians to the Nazis was tragic. And it shaped the theology that I would have been subject to, or in the universities, had I stayed in Germany. So what I was looking for is, are there now openings in Christian theology, and particularly or specifically Christian theology, where one can see that the phenomena identified by these couple of psychologists are in fact taken up, so that a theology can face its past, admit that it needs thorough renewal, if not complete deconstruction. And so I thought, if I'm looking around, where would I find such a theology? And that's behind the story of the title.
You were growing up in Germany at the time of World War II, is that right?
I was born in 1935, so at the time when the enthusiasm for Hitler was just unbelievable in Germany. And so I was 4 years old when the war broke out, and I lived in Germany throughout World War II. And the town where I was born, my father was a chemical engineer in research, and he worked in a factory that produced absolutely essential material for war. Gasoline, explosives, medications, etc. So that the town became subject to air raids. We were located far enough into Germany that it wasn't until 1944 that the Allied bombers could fly on one tank of gas, as I put it, out of England, drop their load and fly back without having to refuel. So I experienced 27 major air raids, and in many instances complete destruction of the town where I grew up. We participated in the life of a local congregation, my family did, so that I stayed in touch with the church. But at that time I was innocent of all this stuff going on, so that it wasn't until much, much later that I know that the minister in that congregation had been someone very supportive of Hitler. So I look back at my own personal history. I look at my baptism, baptized by a minister who was supportive of Hitler. Is that a valid baptism, so to speak? But anyway, some of these personal dimensions are located quite deeply in the experience of the war, and above all, in the community that I was functioning in the school, in the church, in the town where I lived, and its almost total support of Hitler, even to the very end. Yeah.
The name of the company that your father worked for was IG Farben?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. IG Farben was the largest chemical conglomerate in Europe and the second largest in the world after DuPont in the United States. Interestingly enough, DuPont and IG Farben had exchanged patents before World War II. IG Farben was in fact located in the state of New Jersey for a number of years between the two wars. And for me, the interesting phenomenon is that the agreement of the exchange of patents was such that DuPont, during the entire World War II, made faithfully the payments for IG Farben's patents into Swiss bank accounts. And the irony is that the Nazis then would take, or Germany would, IG Farben would take the money out, use it to produce weapons with which to attack the Americans who were supplying the money for these patents. Yeah. So the Americans paid the money, the Germans used the money in order to kill Americans, is the way I put it.
Right.
IG Farben was up to its neck overwhelmed in Auschwitz. They built a factory in Auschwitz. They wanted to move far enough away from the western borders because of the potential air raids. And in 1941, together with the SS, they began to build this factory. And my father had connection. He didn't work in Auschwitz, but he had connections to the leadership in Auschwitz, the industrial leadership in Auschwitz. So that when I now look at the criminal prosecution of IG Farben leadership, most of the names are familiar to me that I heard in my house during my childhood. So my father's connection is, I must say, I'm not terribly happy about this. In fact, I'm not happy at all. But my father's connection motivates me to go deeply, not only into my own education, but into his background and his involvement. And then after the war, when I began to ask questions, his consistent refusal to engage in this subject. It came to the point at one point, Tom, where my mother said to me, now you have to stop asking questions because Father thinks that you are judging him. I went to see him right away, and I told him, Father, I'm not judging you, but I am your child, and I need to know what of your values are my values. So we had a conversation. He ended it by saying, this is the last time we talk about this. If you ever raise any more questions like this, our relationship will be over. I didn't want to lose the relationship to my father, so I gave him the promise, I will never ask you any more questions. What I didn't say to him is that I will ask questions elsewhere. And I explore this to some sense in the book. And so I live with a, how can I say it? I live with an injured relationship to my father and to my mother. But at the same time, they are my parents. Yeah. So this ambiguity is, even to this day, something that weighs on me.
Yeah. And that comes out in a number of different places in the book, not the least of which is, there were parts where certain phrases that you chose jumped out at me, for example, referring to yourself as the son of a perpetrator.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting choice of words, using perpetrator, and maybe could you talk about that a little bit?
There is no question in my mind that my father's work in administering IG Farben, he rose to the top level of the middle executive levels. But the connections that he had with all kinds of people tells me that my father knew enough of what was going on, and in terms of his own work, he has become complicit in what the Nazis were doing. And I am quite prepared to say that complicity makes one a perpetrator. So I don't think my father ever killed a human being. I have no evidence about this. Nor do I have any evidence that he told people, now we have to eliminate so many people. Yeah? But his company paid the SS for the workforce in Auschwitz that was brought from the concentration camps. And I know that. And I know that my father, even though he denied it, visited Auschwitz in 1944. He denied it. I asked him point blank one day, were you ever in Auschwitz? He said no. Subsequently, I found out from in his own handwriting, a diary, that he was in Auschwitz in June 1944. So why did he not admit this? Yeah. So I think my dad was aware of complicity, and I have explored these questions of calling myself a child of a perpetrator. I cannot accept that complicity is not being a perpetrator. Yeah, some people want to restrict this to those who gave the orders to kill and then who did kill, gas, etc., or shooting. But those were people who followed orders, who executed orders. And the orders that my father's company gave to the company officials make him complicit and therefore a perpetrator. I'm completely convinced that that is an almost unassailable argument.
And of course, in the Nuremberg trials, there were some German officials who tried to downplay or soft pedal or whatever the things that they had done by saying that they had just been following orders.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And of course, in that particular instance, it didn't wind up working for them as in terms of being a real defense. And yet we still hear this sort of thing anytime there's anything that resembles a war crime that happens anywhere in the world. That sort of pseudo defense always comes out.
Mm-hmm. When I hear people talking like that, I'd like to turn around and say, well, that fine. If you say I just followed orders, that means that you abdicated all your moral values. Yeah, your moral values were worthless in face of the orders that you received. But then I listen to people who talk about people who give orders. All one has to do is read obituaries of great people who gave those orders. But we call them examples for our children, etc., etc. And to me, that duplicity of argument shows that we are prepared to say, you may have followed orders, but you are still a good human being. And if those orders are to exterminate human beings, then I have more than difficulties. Because that is, I simply can no longer value the integrity of a person who says, I only followed orders, and my orders were to kill millions. Sorry, I don't buy that.
Another thing that you're saying when you described your childhood in Germany and you mentioned that you were baptized by a pastor or priest who was a supporter of
Yes.
Nazism, a supporter of Hitler. It would be particularly interesting for me, and I know that there's been entire books in addition to the one that's sitting right here in front of me, where theologians have discussed how that could possibly be reconciled, between purportedly being a Christian, but also supporting the Nazi regime and supporting Hitler. But what can you give us a relatively, is it possible to even give a relatively brief description of your thoughts on that? Because it's something that kind of boggles my mind. I mean, how that can actually be, those things can actually be connected.
If I have any understanding at all of the biblical affirmations, particularly the affirmations that come out of the Jewish community about the Holy One, and if I look at the forms of life in accordance with what we attribute to the Holy One, then to say I am a Christian and I'm also a supporter of Nazism, or whatever form you want to address it, becomes an impossibility. Yeah, I'm really convinced that the Jewish Torah is very clear about idolatry and blasphemy, false worship, and about the holiness of the Holy One. And there is no compromise in the reading of that text. And so for me to look at a theology capable of mourning, one of the things I look at very quickly is how is the tradition, the Jewish tradition, which of course was the condition of Jesus, whom we claim we follow, how is that maintained? How does it manifest itself in the witness and in the work and in the life of a particular person? Or how does it show up in a theology? Yeah. If I want to turn around and say that those people in Germany, and this sounds judgmental, and I'm prepared to accept that, namely that people who were saying, possibly my parents, who were saying, we are followers of Jesus and we are followers of Hitler, that is an impossible possibility. It's more than that. It's blaspheming the Holy One. So I'm pretty sharp on this kind of distinction, and until we begin to engage, or until we really seriously engage this kind of conversation with what it means to say I'm a follower of Jesus, or I'm someone who believes in the God of Israel, then I want to find out, okay, where do you make your compromise if you say I'm also a follower of Nazism? Yeah.
Yeah. There are so many phrases that really jump out at me in this book, and that add to the compelling nature of the writing and the thoughts that you're expressing. In chapter 6, the phrase political worship of God really jumps out at me.
Yeah.
What, for those who are watching this who may not yet have had a chance to read this wonderful book, what is the political worship of God?
There is a phrase in the Bible. It's attributed to the Holy One, where he says, I can't stand your holy feast. All this incense, all these things that you're doing, I can't stand them. Why don't you go and love the neighbor? Why don't you go and look after the widow? Why don't you look after the people who are poor? In other words, why aren't you political? Yeah. The word politics derives from the Greek word of polis, the city. Yeah, and there's another phrase in the Old Testament in Jeremiah, where he says, "Seek ye the welfare of the city," and the welfare of the city is political. Yeah, and that's the kind of worship that the Holy One is instructing the people to follow. If you really want to worship me, and now I want to say, if you really want to worship me, become political. Engage yourself in your community, and then do justice. Yeah. I want to admit that to say the political worship of God means now that you must join a political party. No, it doesn't mean that at all. Or that you now maybe even seek a political office. If you seek a political office, then I would want to watch what you do as a politician before I talk about the political worship of God. So that's for me the way of getting into this understanding. We don't really worship. Again, that sounds judgmental. We don't really worship as long as we just have the rituals and follow them. One of my teachers at McGill University, where I studied theology, once made the remark, we worship God on Sunday, we pray to God on Sunday, and on the neighbor during the week. I like that little shift of one letter, yeah? Mm-hmm. And he said, now that's where you have, where you see the absence of political worship. Yeah.
Something that I've noticed here in America, in a number of faith communities where I visited, over the last maybe 10 years or so, is a little bit of twisting around, sort of a semantics thing going on with that word political. It's used differently and based on what you were just saying, improperly, because you'll sometimes hear people within those groups or organizations saying, we shouldn't be getting into political things and talking about politics. And they even extend that beyond, the sort of Trump or no Trump discussion into things like racism or, homelessness or something like that, and calling the other person's discussion or argument political, but using the term political in a kind of derisive way, or as if it's a non-spiritual thing to be talking about those sort of things.
Yes, yeah. Well, to me, this is duplicity. It has a little bit to do with the fact that we want to compartmentalize much of our lives. Yeah, this is my private life. This is my public life. This is my marriage. This is my faith, etc., etc. Various compartments, and we want to protect one compartment from the others. Yeah, so that someone might say on Sunday, and in fact, I go to worship God. I go to church and I meet with those people there, and then during the week in my work, I address a different context. To me, this is subterfuge. Yeah. I don't want to say, I don't want to charge individuals with that kind of a comment. One of my biggest temptations is to be judgmental. But now that I recognize that, I'm more alert to it. So I don't want to attack individuals on this, but I want to say that this division of our lives into compartments is an escape mechanism or a protective mechanism that I have watched long enough in Nazi Germany and way beyond the end of World War II. I'm 83 years old. I've seen a bit. Yeah, and I can see this compartmentalization. In order for our lives to be orderly and not let one thing from one compartment affect other things in another compartment. So we want to protect ourselves in some sense. And then in the end, of course, to be able to say, you see, but I'm innocent. I'm not complicit. Yeah. What I have experienced in Nazi Germany, in my own family, in the church, is that such kind of artificial construction of our existence is not possible. Yeah. For me, as a theologian, I talk about my theological existence as political, and I talk about my political existence as theological. Yeah. Maybe I need to write another book on this one, Tom, to be more explicit or more expansive on that point.
That would be great. I'd love to see that. Going back for a second to that word judgmental, that's a term that's constantly thrown around, not only in faith communities, sort of as a defensive term now and then. And of course, that's not to say that there aren't situations where someone is actually being judgmental. But isn't there a significant difference between being judgmental and discerning? And isn't that difference something that can be supported? The idea of being discerning can be supported and even cited as being encouraged by Scripture.
Let me come at the answer by a little detour. At an event in a synagogue recently, I was asked, if you had the chance to talk to the President of the United States, what would you say? And I replied as follows. I said, the first thing I want to say is to myself, and that is to remind myself I'm in the presence of a child of God. I'm in the presence of someone who is shaped in the image of the Holy One. And that I need to remember all the time when I talk to that person. And at that particular moment, at this point, I want to say something about being judgmental. Judgmental for me is where we give into the temptation of denying the God-likeness or the image of God in the person who's in front of me. Yeah. So if I encounter someone whose politics or whose work is I find worthy of judgment, what I think I'm trying to do is to help a person find a way back to being, or to deal with the distorted or disfigured image of the Holy One in that person. So when I talk about, when I want to be judgmental, I remind myself continuously who it is who is in front of me. And judgmental in the other sense in which you've described it, in my judgment, requires that you no longer recognize who it is and who is in front of you, but just somebody whose deeds, whose words, etc., you don't agree with, and you pass judgment. Yeah. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's an absolutely essential and necessary thing to do at all times. Yeah. Another aspect of judgmentalism is that in many ways, I may want to refuse to talk to somebody. I mean, I could have said to this person, pardon me, I would never talk to the President of the United States. That's judgmental. Because I would have already very clearly said, he's not worthy of my conversation. And that's what I want to avoid. Yeah?
Going back to the book, you write about an encounter that you had after you gave a presentation, and I just want to throw this in here for those who have the interest. There are out online on YouTube some of Martin Rumscheidt's presentations and talks that he's done, and They are phenomenal, so I encourage people to seek them out. One of the stories that you tell about an encounter that you had after a presentation was a woman comes up to you and gives you a commandment, as you call it. Can you tell us about that story?
I was on a panel, this is in Philadelphia, 2000. I was on a panel with a reporter from CNN, who's now a fairly high-profile journalist, with a medical doctor, with an engineer, and myself as a theologian. In the audience, the CNN person said, in the audience, my father and mother are right there. He pointed them out. And he said they survived because they lived in the sewers in Łódź. That's how they survived. And when my turn came, I looked at the father and mother, and I said, if you find me as a German speaking to you painful, let me know and I will not speak. And the man looked at me and he said, speak. With his finger right at me, speak. When we were finished, the whole panel was done, people came forward, and in the group that wanted to talk to me was an older lady. And she just came up to me. And the first thing she did, she embraced me, held me in her arms, held me very strong hands. Didn't say anything, and then she let go, and then she rolled up her sleeve, and there was the number, the Auschwitz number. And then he said, young man, I'm 67, 65 years old, young man, I liked her for that. Yeah. She said, young man, today I give you a commandment. You must speak. And that to me is a sacred trust. And in some sense, I'm quite prepared to say that was a divine commandment. Yeah. She heard something in what I had to say that she said, that is what I, a survivor, wanted to hear. And there are others. Yeah. Even right now, I'm obedient to her commandment in our conversation, Tom. Yeah. Unforgettable moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Really a moving moment that you write well and speak well about. You're a noted expert on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Could you just maybe tell for the uninitiated who he was and why we should remember who he was?
I became aware of Dietrich Bonhoeffer through another teacher of mine in Switzerland, Karl Barth. I had begun a conversation with Karl Barth about how he, as a Swiss, although he was teaching in Germany at the beginning of Hitler years, how he was in opposition to the Nazis. And I wanted to know how does opposition to a political party and the life of a country, how does that arise out of theological convictions? And he said to me, I want you to read a German theologian by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was in fact in the resistance and was found out and was executed, was killed by the Nazis. Bonhoeffer was in fairly high circles, political and administrative circles, people who were wanted to resist Hitler. They had come to the conclusion that the only way one could remove Hitler from power was by killing him. All other attempts wouldn't work. They were convinced of this. But then a number of the people were saying, a number of the resistors were saying, we cannot break the commandment. Don't murder. And Bonhoeffer, and this is the thing that really impressed me by him, he said, yes, but can we allow the killing of Jews to go on and on and on and on and on and become more and more vicious? By that time, Bonhoeffer knew of the millions of people who had been shot by the SS and by the German army. He said, that murder has to stop. And the only way we can do it is by murdering Hitler. He said, of course we are guilty. But then he said a very interesting thing. For me, this is theologically highly significant. He said, but we can exist before the Holy One. We can exist in the face of the Holy One as guilty human beings. Because there is forgiveness. But before he said there is forgiveness, he also said, yes, there is God's judgment. But can we exist in the face of God by knowing that millions of Jews are being murdered and we don't do anything? We exist irrespective of what we do. We exist before in the face of God as complicit. And I thought, what a fascinating way to do theology. To begin to do theology knowing that irrespective of what we're doing, there are times when we are complicit and therefore we are guilty and we are worthy of divine judgment. But we can throw ourselves onto the mercy of God. That blew my mind. Yeah. So this whole sense of having a clean conscience falls apart. We can't have a clean conscience if we let the murder. We cannot have a clean conscience as we walk and demonstrate, let's say in Charlottesville. Yeah. Either side, we can't do that with a clear conscience. But we can do it because we want to save life, or we want to stop certain injustice, or we want to reverse certain things. In other words, if we want to do political worship of God. Yeah. So Bonhoeffer has become to me a very impressive figure. You know, he did all sorts of things that I want to question. But to have such a clear understanding of what theological or what religious existence is like in the world today, and to say, yes, I can break certain rules. I have to break certain rules. In fact, I can even break the commandments that we have been given by the Holy One. Because we can choose on which side we want to be. Guilty on this side or guilty on that side, but it's guilty. And that helps with a theology capable of mourning.
Before we wrap up, much as I could continue here for quite a while, is there anything else that you would like to, that you wanted to be sure to talk about during this interview?
I want to insist on the correct distinction and separation of church and state. The state is not the church is not the state. But the church is in the state. And the state recognizes the church's presence. What the state cannot do is tell the church, this is how you need to behave in order to be in the state. Although churches keep doing that all the time. They buckle down and say, yeah, okay. Nor can the church go to the state and this is what you need to do. But the church can hold the state to account for what the state does. And that's why I think there are so many movements in the church now which I welcome, against racism, against xenophobia, now against the refugees and immigrants. Yeah. And is there not something in the church that we can say and we can do? And in fact, is there not something in the church that says, and now we will have to tell the state, no, don't. Yeah. And that to me is where I find the life of existence, of Christian theological existence, very interesting. We don't always have the right solutions, but we are talking to each other about them. And that creates the understanding of who the neighbor is and how we love the neighbor, and etc., etc. So in a way, the institutional church is suffering, and probably rightly so. It's long overdue that we shift away from this kind of institutionalization. But the church is also very much alive to how to be human beings with one another, and how to be nations in relation to one another. And that's why I still, in many ways, want to be part of the church, continue, and be not optimistic but hopeful. Yeah.
Martin Rumscheidt, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Tom.
And for viewers, again, Martin's latest book is called In Search of a Theology Capable of Mourning. Absolutely highly recommended reading. And that's it for this time. Thanks for watching.